Are we a race? Are we a people, a tribe, a religion, ethnicity, a philosophy, culture? Well, sort of a little bit of everything. It's certainly not only a religion, okay? Because first of all, conventionally we think of religion as something, it's a set of beliefs, practices, but you're born into being Jewish, even by the most traditional definition. So an identity you get from birth is usually an ethnic identity of some kind. Although in Islam as well, if your father is Muslim, then you're claimed as a Muslim as well, which led to the odd circumstance occasionally you get Jewish women marrying Muslim men and they're claimed by both sides. Yeah. And if it's the opposite, neither one wants them. So that's the quirks of intermarriage in that world. And we also use language like someone's a member of the tribe. You know, and that's again a very tribalist way to say it. And actually, it's one of the reasons why Jewish identity is in flux among millennials and younger people, because they don't like tribalism. Tribalism is a bad word for them.
Really?
Yeah, it's parochial, it's chauvinist, it's divisive. They want to be just human, and especially because now there's a large generation of children of intermarriage. You know, about half of the marriages involving Jews have been with non-Jewish partners since 1990, so for 30 years. There's a whole generation of kids that have grown up with many of their friends having one parent of each. They don't want to have to pick, you know, and the idea of being a member in two tribes at the same time is tricky. It's like being a fan of two baseball teams in the same city. You know, usually you pick one or the other, and that's it. It's Dodgers or Angels, or it's Cubs or White Sox in Chicago. And you can't, what do you mean you root for both? Well, one parent roots for one parent roots for the other. No, you've got to pick one. People don't, you know, there's that tribal mentality, and some people are not, are actively turned off by that. But also, Jewishness isn't really simply an ethnic group. Because when you think of classical models of ethnic groups, they all look the same. They all come from the same place. They all speak the same language. They all have the same material culture and clothing, and right? What are the markers of ethnic identity? But Jewish culture is very diverse. We saw examples of the faces. That's just one example. And Jewish food for my father was very different than Jewish food for my mother. Jewish language was different because they spoke Judeo-Arabic in my dad's house and they spoke Yiddish in my mom's family. So it's a more complicated sense than just a simple ethnicity. You can be an Ashkenazi Jew, that's an ethnicity. You could be a Sephardi Jew from Spain originally, or a Mizrahi Jew from the Middle East, or a Mughrabi Jew from North Africa. Those have some continuity of language and culture and food and clothing and appearance and genetics. But as a broader category, it's more complicated.
Is that because it's so nomadic?
Well, part of it is wandering, and part of it is we've always married native women. You see, the merchants, the men would travel, and they would find a local wife. Jews in Ethiopia and Jews in India don't look different because of the food or the water. They look different because they married local people, and it traces out, you know, that you can trace the maternal line to what's called mitochondrial DNA. It's the DNA that comes in the egg, so the father doesn't contribute any of it. It's actually, mitochondria are separate little organisms inside the cell. So you can trace your mitochondrial DNA back purely through the mother's line. And they found that in many of these communities, it shows it was a male Jew meeting a native woman who was from China, India, Iraq, wherever. And actually, the European experience is unusual. There's relatively little mixing of the broader cultures and the genetic material, but in other parts of the world, it was much more blended. So, look, we came from the Middle East. We probably looked like classic Arabs to start with, but as we traveled, we blended. And so, if people think intermarriage is a new phenomenon, it's a very old phenomenon. We've been doing it the whole time. And also, if you want to join the Jewish people, traditionally, you go through what's called a religious conversion. So it's not an ethnicity in that sense. It's called one of the world's three great Western religions, right? You've got Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. But Judaism still maintains a kind of quasi-ethnic sense because you can be Christian and Nigerian, and Christian and Italian, and Christian and Korean, and Christian and Norwegian. And you can be Muslim and Nigerian, and Muslim and Indonesian, and Muslim and Pakistani. And so they're multi-ethnic world religions. But when you're Jewish, you're a Jew living in Iran, you're a Persian Jew as a flake, but you're not Persian simple. You're not Polish simple. You're a Jew living in Poland. So there's a sense of a ethnic, cultural division or segregation, or however you want to define it, that marks the Jews as different, not just by religious belief. So that's why it's complicated to put our finger on exactly what it is. And after all, if it was just a religion, most Jews don't believe what they're supposed to. They don't follow the ritual practices they're supposed to. They eat the food they're not supposed to. They don't recite the prayers and blessings they're supposed to. So if you defined it by practice or belief, most Jews wouldn't be Jewish if you were being really strict about it. So that's where we have to be a little bit more flexible. So what we're going to do today is go back in time and get a sense of where Jewish identity started, and how it evolved, and some of the complications that came about over the centuries as we develop. So if we go back to our origins, where did the Jews start? The Jews started in a place called Judea, where we get the name. We were originally Judeans from Judea. It was a national, territorial identity. And if we had particular religious practices, they were the national religious practices. Remember, no separation of religion and government until modern times. So in the ancient world, say 3,000 years ago, if you lived in Judea, you followed Judean cultural practices, you spoke Judean language, and you did Judean religion, even if you were a resident alien from another people or tribe. So Uriah the Hittite shows up in the David stories. Remember Bathsheba, the woman he steals, is married to Uriah the Hittite. So he's able to marry a Jewish woman, a Judean woman, that's fine. In fact, David's the one in the wrong for stealing her from him. But he's still described as Uriah the Hittite. He's what would have been called in biblical Hebrew a ger. Ger means resident alien. Like gur means to reside. Like to not live as in be alive, but to live as in space. And so if you were a resident alien, you were still expected to clean out all the chametz from your house for Passover. You had to only have matzah during that week of Passover. It was a national prohibition on any leavened bread. So it wasn't that they went house to house and said, are you a Hittite? Are you a Judean? Are you an Assyrian? And then you got to choose what you wanted to do. No, if you're living in Judea, you do what Judeans do. And at that time of year, it was a national rule that their God gave them to follow.
And if they didn't?
They could be subject to the same kind of cutting out and expelling as a Hebrew would be if they didn't follow the rules. And so this was a national culture. It actually evolved out of a Canaanite culture. The god Yud-He-Vav-He, the name for God that you're not supposed to say, sort of like Voldemort in the Harry Potter books.
Why are you not supposed to say it?
Well, you're not supposed to take the Lord's name in vain. That's one of those commandments. And the thought was that anybody but the high priest at the moment of Yom Kippur saying it is somewhat less than the highest level of holiness. It's a whole world, it's a world of magic words and taboos and, avoid the dangerous things. You see, God power is like, the comparison I make is it's like high voltage electricity, where it can do wondrous things if you know what you're doing. But if you go into that high voltage box with a wrench and just try to fool around, you're going to get zapped. And so the same is true with the divine power. If you use that name of God as it's actually written, and not with a substitute like Adonai, my Lord, or Hashem, the name, it's too dangerous. You need the experts who know what they're doing, the priests with training and purity to do it. Otherwise, you're going to get zapped. There's even a story in the Torah of two sons of Aaron who go and offer strange fire before the Hebrew God, and they get burned, literally. And as a warning to say, let the high priest do it. Now, from the priest's perspective, that's a good business, right? They have the monopoly, right? So they have an advantage, they have an interest in presenting stories like that. But from our perspective, looking at it historically, that Hebrew name for the god, Yud-He-Vav-He, was a Canaanite god, part of the Canaanite pantheon of gods. And then the Judeans claim that that's their god alone, and eventually he is the only one they're allowed to worship. Most likely their theology proceeded as they had many gods, then they had one god more important than all the other gods. Then that god says, I don't want you worshiping any other gods. Remember the phrase, I am a jealous God, right? You have no other gods before me. There are other gods, they just have to sit in the back. I'm most important.
And that was when?
We're talking in the 900, 800, 700 BCE, in that range. We don't have exact dates because the later writers sort of wrote over the history, and we're trying to decipher it based on archaeology and what evidence we can find. But at the time that the Ten Commandments text is put together, again, probably in that time period, again, there are other gods, they just have to be behind. There's no other gods before me. I'm the only one you're allowed to talk to. And it's a system called monolatry. Idolatry is worshiping idols. Monolatry is you can only worship one God. You can only talk to one God. I don't want you even looking at any other gods. In fact, the phrase that's used when the Israelites do worship other gods is literally they went whoring after other gods.
They went what?
Whoring.
Wow.
Znut is like a zonah is a whore. So they prostituted themselves to other gods. They were unfaithful. I mean, think of a jealous husband who puts them out. So once you have monolatry and you're only allowed to worship one God, it's a short step from there to what we think of now as monotheism, that there's only one God. Because if your God's more important than all the others, and you're only allowed to talk to one God, and you're allowed to talk to the other ones, eventually you sort of demote the other gods to angels or demons, and then there really is only one God who deserves the title God. And that's most likely around the year 500 BCE that we make that full shift to monotheism. So it's much later than the original history is presented. In fact, the first text I give you from Joshua is written much later, in that 500 BCE period, where they're trying to project back this idea that we were always monotheistic. So you have in the very beginning in Joshua 24. Joshua said to all the people, Yahweh says, the God of Israel, your fathers lived of old time beyond the river, even Terah, the father of Abraham, father of Nahor, and they served other gods. I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him throughout all the land of Canaan, multiplied his offspring and gave him Isaac, and Jacob and Esau, and the pedigree, and so on. They went down to Egypt. I sent Moses and Aaron and plagued Egypt. I brought your fathers out of Egypt. You came to the sea. The Egyptians pursued your fathers with chariots and horsemen. When they cried out to Yahweh, he put darkness between you and the Egyptian, brought the sea on them and covered it, and your eyes saw what I did in Egypt. Then in the next underlined part, they fight against the natives of the land of Canaan, and they conquer them, and they drove them out. And now, therefore, fear Yahweh, and serve him in sincerity and in truth. Put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river in Egypt, and serve Yahweh. So only worship this one God. The people answered, far be it from us, we should forsake Yahweh to serve other gods. It is Yahweh our God who brought us and our fathers up out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who did great signs in our sight and preserved us in all the ways we went among all the peoples through the middle of whom we passed. And then here's Joshua responding. You can't serve Yahweh, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your disobedience nor your sins. If you forsake Yahweh and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you evil and consume you after he has done you good. And they say, yes, we will serve him. They swear it. We are witnesses.
So why does it say you can't?
Well, he's trying to suggest that he's trying to suggest maybe you don't want to do this.
Oh,
You know, it's,
if you
this
can.
is risky.
If you can.
Well, or even more so, maybe, are you sure you guys really want to do this? Because if you serve him, he's going to hold you to a standard, and if you break the rules, he's going to punish you. Now, what makes this passage particularly interesting is it's most likely written after the disaster already happened. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the Judean exile happens in 586 BCE. So they're coming back from the exile around 500 BCE, and now they have an explanation for why the disaster happened. It was our fault, right? We made a promise all the way back when we first showed up in the land 400 years ago, and we blew it. And so the fact that we lost doesn't mean that Yahweh was weak. It means that Yahweh was strong enough to fulfill what he told us he would do. It was our fault.
We broke our promise.
We broke the promise. We made a deal. We said, we're witnesses. We swore it. You have testimony in this written book that the priests had brought back from Babylon, that we now call the Torah. So we blew it. It's our fault. And we should be serving only Yahweh, and we didn't do it.
Pretty strong that, they're saying we were able to fight against all of these enemies with God's help. All of these, no.
Initially, yeah. Right, well-
until they were
Well, but that's making the point. You know, if we were on Yahweh's team the whole time, we would have kept winning.
Yeah.
But because we blew it, that's why we lost. And they even give examples, by the way, in the books of the kings, the history books, of this breaking the rules. So this section in 2 Kings 23 describes King Josiah. He's ruling just before the temple is destroyed, around the year 620 BCE. And look at what it's describing him doing. He commands the high priest and the priests of the second order and so on to bring out of the temple of Yahweh all the vessels made for Baal, the other god, the Canaanite god, and for the grove, for the Asherah, which is a fertility goddess, and for all the host of heaven. And he burned them outside of Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron and carried the ashes to Bethel. He put down the idolatrous priests, whom the kings of Judah had ordained to burn incense in the high places, the cities of Judah and the places around Jerusalem. Those that burned incense to Baal, the sun, the moon, the planets, and all the army of heaven. He brought out the Asherah, the grove, from the house of Yahweh to the brook of Kidron, burned it there, stamped it to small powder, and threw the powder thereof on the graves of the children of the people. Get some hostility there, right? But this is a purification. The temple, before this point, has had all these things in it. And here he is trying to clean it out. So this is the revisionist history that's being written in Joshua after they're coming back. It's saying, oh, we were always perfect and pure, and then we went astray a little bit. But Josiah is writing after the temple's been around for 300 years. And they've been doing all this stuff for 300 years. So this focus to monotheism, to a primarily religious instead of a national identity with lots of gods from different places and cultures, that's a shift. It's a change from what it used to be, which was more or less a Canaanite style of religion. Now it's becoming a more monotheistic and not polytheistic version.
And it still permeates, I notice this history, but it still permeates in what you heard from your friend. You're not Jewish, you don't believe in God. If you don't believe in the power of a God over everything, you're not Jewish. So it's incredible how it's in there.
Well, let's jump forward even to the end of this passage. If you flip onto the back of that sheet.
Yeah.
The top of the page. So he goes on, he takes away the high places before Jerusalem, he takes away the Ashtoreth and Chemosh and all these other gods, and defiles them with men's bones, so it makes them never holy again. And then at the bottom it says, the king commanded all the people, saying, keep the Passover, Pesach, to Yahweh your God, as it is written in the book of this covenant. Surely there was not held such a Passover from the days of the judges that judged Israel, nor in all the days of the kings of Israel, nor of the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of Josiah, this Passover was held. What kind of Judaism were they running in Jerusalem for the previous 400 years with no Passover? And then you read a passage later after they returned from exile where they do Sukkot for the first time since the days of the judges. So what kind of Judaism was it with no Sukkot and no Passover? I mean, obviously, these are later innovations that are being brought in, and then they're projecting it back and saying, well, we were always supposed to do it, and we didn't do it right, and that explains why the disaster happened. But it's during that exile period that Jewish identity shifts from a national identity to a religious identity. Because after all, maintaining a national identity when your nation's been destroyed, that required pilgrimage to Jerusalem and sacrifice at a temple, and you're in exile in Babylon, hundreds of miles away. And this is Uber, can't get there so easily. So how do you maintain a sense of who you are? Well, this is the priestly masterstroke. This is that shift of saying, no, it's not that Yahweh was weak, it's that Yahweh was strong. He made it happen. So you can still trust us as the priests of Yahweh to tell you what's right, because, in fact, we're still right. It was your fault. It's not our fault, it wasn't Yahweh's fault, it was your fault. They're also fortunate that the Babylonians wipe out the kings as an alternate source of authority for Judeans. Because there were some rebellions and they decided to put them down, so they take the last king of Judea and they kill all of his sons in front of him and then put out his eyes. Wow. But what that does is it makes it impossible to replace him because he's still alive. He's just powerless and he has no heirs. So it puts them in this sort of limbo political position, but it also means that the monarchy as an authority is not really available anymore. And then the priests have one other group they have to deal with. They're called the prophets. Because the prophets go around and saying, Yahweh says this, and Yahweh says that, and Yahweh says you're doing it wrong. Well, if you're a priest, you don't want someone else going around telling the people you're doing it wrong, according to Yahweh. So how do they outmaneuver the priests, the prophets? They say, we have a book. It's a book written by the best prophet ever. Better than all that came before, better than all that came since. And so we don't really need prophets anymore because we have this book by the best prophet ever. So, bye-bye. Thank you, prophets, go away. And guess who's left to interpret this book? The priests. That's right. And guess who's left on top, according to the book? The priests. So, it's a really brilliant political maneuver to shift this, but it also means shifting the identity, because when you had rule by a monarchy, that's more like a classic national identity. If you have rule by priests, that sounds more like what we might consider a religious identity, or a theocracy, if you think about Iran, which is ruled by clergy too. It really becomes a kind of ethno-religious identity, because after they're allowed to return from Babylon, some of them stay. They don't all come back. The roots of the Iraqi Jewish community actually go back to 500 BCE with those Jews who stayed there and didn't come back to Jerusalem. So this is the shift. And you can see the ethno-religious side of it in the next source in your packet, which is what I call Jewish purification. So scroll down. In the book of Ezra. Ezra is writing again after they returned from Babylon, but we hear a new standard that wasn't the case before. Remember, Bathsheba married Uriah the Hittite. Joseph marries the daughter of an Egyptian priest. There's no comment on that. Moses marries a third wife who may not have been Jewish. David and Solomon marry wives from all over the place. Ruth the Moabite becomes the great-grandmother of King David. So there's very flexible boundaries for men or women from outside the Jewish world marrying into this national identity. But now, the door closes. So here's what Ezra says to the people. Now our God, what shall we say after this? For we have forsaken your commandments, which you commanded by your servants the prophets, saying, the land to which you go to possess it is an unclean land, through the uncleanness of the peoples of the land, through their abominations, which have filled it from one end to another with their filthiness. Get a sense of judgment there? Now therefore, don't give your daughters to their sons. Don't take their daughters to your sons, nor seek their peace or prosperity forever, that you may be strong, eat of the good of the land, and leave it for an inheritance to your children forever. So it's another way of blaming them for the disaster. Not only did you not kick them out like you were supposed to, but you actually had the audacity to marry them.
Is that related to then the Jews coming back from Babylon with their
or finding Jews who
wives.
stayed in the land who married other peoples. Remember, when you exile a population, you generally don't exile everybody. You take the elites out, because those are the ones you have to worry about. The peasantry is the peasantry. It doesn't really matter. So when they came back, there was a feeling that this peasantry had been mixed up with some other peoples, and we need to become separate, pure again. After all that has come upon us for our evil deeds and our great guilt, since you have punished us less than our sins deserve, and have given us a remnant, shall we again break your commandments and join in affinity with the people that do these abominations? We just saw what happened. He just destroyed Judea. He burned the temple. He exiled the people. You're going to do it again? No. So now, as he made a great confession and weeping and casting himself before God's house, a great assembly of men and women and children came, and one of them answered him. This is the underlined passage at the bottom. We have trespassed against our God, and have married foreign women of the peoples of the land. Yet now there is hope for Israel concerning this thing. Let us make a covenant with our God to put away all the wives, and those who are as born of them, according to the counsel of my Lord, and of those who tremble at the commandment of our God. Let it be done according to the law. Be courageous and do it. And so they do, in fact, some of them send away those foreign wives, and this is most likely the time period where the identity of what makes the kid Jewish begins to shift. In the biblical period, it seems to be a patrilineal definition. If the father's Jewish, then the kids are identified with the Judean people.
That was prior.
National identity prior. This is most likely the beginning of a shift to a more matrilineal definition. But it's a process, and it doesn't really get cemented until the time of the Mishnah and the Talmud, the rabbinic period, in the first few centuries of the Common Era, on our side of the year zero.
So that shift happened from a patriarchal.
Say around, let's say from 300 BC to 300 AD or CE, in that window is when that shift happens. You often hear it presented as, well, you always know who the mother is, and in cases of rape, they wanted to identify the kids as Jewish or whatever. That's maybe an after-the-fact kind of rationalization. And I'll also point to, again, that Jewish ethnic diversity you see out there in the broader world of Jewish diaspora. How rigid were they in making sure the women were converted before they married the man? There were no rabbis out there in the middle of nowhere, and so maybe it was a little more mixing, and then after the fact, just accepting it as the way it was. Don't ask, don't tell, and move forward. Okay, so this is part of that shift from a monarchy to a theocracy, and from a national identity to an ethno-religious identity. So you could be a Jew in Alexandria, Egypt, or a Jew in Babylon, and still identify as a Jew because you have a tie to a land in the ethnic sense, but a theology and a ritual practice in a religious sense.